The dog was not digging for bones. Staff Sergeant Caleb Whitaker knew that before anyone else did, before the first porch light flickered on across the rain-dark street, before the first whisper moved through Greyhaven like a match struck in a church basement. Ranger had dug for lost hikers before. He had dug through snowdrifts, storm debris, and collapsed storage sheds after hurricanes along the coast. He had dug with focus, with training, with that silent discipline only a working K-9 carries in his bones. But this was different. This was not a search. This was a plea. Rain fell softly over the old St. Agnes Chapel, turning the weeds silver and the gravel path black beneath Caleb's boots. The chapel had been empty for years, its white paint peeling in long curls, its stained glass windows patched with plywood, its bell tower leaning just enough to make every local parent tell their children not to play too close. A rusted iron fence circled the property, though one side had sagged open long ago, leaving a gap wide enough for a man and a German shepherd to pass through without touching metal. Caleb had only meant to walk by. That was what he kept telling himself. He had come back to Greyhaven to settle his late father's house, sign a few papers, load what little mattered into his pickup, and leave before the town remembered too much of him. He was 37 now, white, broad-shouldered, with close-cut brown hair darkened by rain and eyes the color of a storm just before it breaks. The Marine Corps had taught him how to move through danger, how to read silence, how to keep his face calm when the world underneath him cracked. But it had never taught him how to return to a place where every road knew his name. Ranger stopped first. One moment the leash hung loose in Caleb's hand, and the next it pulled tight. Not sharp, not excited, just certain. The 6-year-old German shepherd stood frozen beside the chapel fence, sable coat wet along the spine, amber eyes fixed beyond the crooked gate. His ears lifted, his breath slowed. Caleb followed his stare toward the rear of the chapel, where an old oak tree bent over the yard like a tired guardian. Beneath it stood a small stone statue of Mary, cracked at the shoulder, her face worn smooth by weather and time. "Come on, boy," Caleb said quietly. "Not tonight." Ranger did not move. A low sound rose in his throat, not a growl, not quite a whine, but something caught between warning and grief. Caleb felt it before he understood it. That old tightening under the ribs. The feeling that comes when the air changes and every living thing knows it except you. Then Ranger stepped through the broken gate. Caleb could have pulled him back. A trained dog listens. A handler commands. But some orders feel wrong before they leave the mouth. So Caleb followed, boots sinking into wet grass, rain ticking softly against the brim of his cap. The closer they came to the oak, the stranger Ranger became. He lowered his nose to the ground, moved in a slow circle, stopped near the base of the statue, then turned suddenly toward a patch of earth beside the chapel wall. The ground there looked ordinary. Grass, mud, a scattering of dead leaves. Nothing more. Ranger placed one paw on it, then another. He looked back at Caleb, and in that single glance the Marine saw something he had seen only once before, in the eyes of a young corporal overseas who had found a child's shoe beneath rubble and refused to leave until everyone listened. Ranger began to dig. Not wild, not frantic, deliberate. His front paws tore into the soft earth, throwing mud against the chapel stones. Caleb dropped the leash and stepped closer. "Ranger, easy." The dog kept going. "Ranger, stop." He did not stop. His claws scraped roots, struck pebbles, sank deeper. Mud darkened his muzzle. Rain ran down his ears. The sound of digging filled the chapel yard, steady and urgent, like a heart refusing to quit. Caleb crouched beside him and touched his shoulder. Ranger trembled beneath his hand, not from cold, but from purpose. "What did you find?" Caleb whispered. The wind moved through the broken chapel window. Somewhere inside, an old loose board creaked. Then, from the tower above them, came a sound that made Caleb's hand go still. One bell note. Soft. Hollow. Impossible. Everyone in Greyhaven knew the bell at St. Agnes had been broken. For more than 12 years. Caleb looked up through the ring. The tower was dark. No rope moved. No light burned inside. Yet the sound drifted over the yard and faded into the wet trees as if someone unseen had touched the metal once and let the whole town remember. Ranger dug harder. Caleb's pulse slowed into the cold rhythm he knew from hard moments. He reached into the hole and brushed mud away with his bare fingers. At first he felt only roots. Then cloth. Old cloth. He worked carefully, easing it loose from the packed ground, while Ranger backed away just enough to watch. It was a small piece of faded blue fabric, wrapped around something thin and hard. Caleb peeled it open. In his palm lay a child's silver bracelet, tarnished nearly black, with a tiny cross charm still clinging to one broken link. 3 letters were carved on the inside, faint but readable beneath the mud. E. H. Caleb did not speak. Across the street, a porch light snapped on. Then another. A curtain shifted in the house beside the bakery. The rain kept falling, gentle as a prayer no one had finished. Ranger lowered his head and pressed his nose to the bracelet, then looked toward the chapel doors, shut tight with old chains. Caleb closed his fingers around the little piece of silver, and only then did he remember the name every adult in Greyhaven had learned to lower their voice around. Emily Harper. 12 years gone. 12 years buried under rumor, pity, and silence. And now, beside an old chapel no one entered anymore, a German shepherd had dug her name back into the rain. Caleb stood in the rain, the bracelet cool and heavy in his palm, watching as Ranger circled the spot once more, nostrils flaring, tail low and stiff. The town of Greyhaven, usually quiet at this hour, seemed to hold its breath. Streetlights flickered through the mist, illuminating the wet brick facades and puddles reflecting the chapel and the oak tree like a double vision. The distant sound of the river, swollen from last night's storm, added a soft, steady hum to the scene, like the pulse of the town itself. Caleb's boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he crouched closer to Ranger, sensing that the dog was not finished, that the air held more secrets than one piece of jewelry could reveal. He could smell the damp wood of the chapel, the wet leaves, and something more, something almost metallic and old that made the hair at the back of his neck lift. The sky above was gray and heavy, pressing down, yet the rain had softened enough to allow him to see the contours of the chapel yard clearly, the cracks in the stone, the way the ivy clung stubbornly to the wall, defying the years. Ranger pawed again, pausing mid-motion, then lowered his head, pressing it against Caleb's thigh in a brief, reassuring touch before returning to the earth. Caleb followed the motion with his hands, brushing aside leaves and stones with careful, deliberate movements, revealing a faint outline of a small wooden box beneath the mud. The box was weathered, its edges swollen from rain, yet still intact, the latch rusted but holding. Caleb's fingers lingered on the surface, tracing the grain, feeling the decades of weather and neglect, and he imagined the hands that had buried it here, hoping no one would ever find it. The quiet of the town was almost oppressive. Windows in the surrounding houses were dark, but faint silhouettes could be seen moving behind curtains, people curious, cautious, sensing something stirring that had not been felt for years. Caleb did not speak. Words felt inadequate. He opened the box slowly, the hinges creaking, and inside lay a folded bundle of papers, yellowed with age, tied with a fraying ribbon. There were photographs, a small notebook, and a thin brass key, all arranged as if someone had carefully chosen what they wanted discovered, leaving clues for the patient and the observant. Caleb lifted the photographs, noting faces frozen in time, children with bright eyes and unsteady smiles, a family long gone from the town's daily life, but not from its memory. He touched the edges of the notebook, the pages brittle, and opened it to the first line, written in a careful, looping hand. To those who find this, remember her story. Ranger nudged his hand with his nose, eyes bright and expectant. Caleb could hear the dog's breathing, steady, reassuring, and he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. The same weight he had carried on deployments, the same weight that had taught him patience, observation, and trust in instincts. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and wet earth from the hills beyond the town, mingling with the smell of rain-soaked stone. Caleb noticed a faint glow from a window across the street, likely a neighbor watching quietly, and he felt the presence of history in the air, of generations who had walked these streets and carried secrets in their hearts. He turned the box in his hands, examining each photograph, each folded page, and realized the notebook was a journal belonging to the child whose bracelet he had just uncovered, Emily Harper. The writing spoke of simple days, laughter, small adventures along the river, notes of kindness witnessed, and finally, fears carefully hidden, thoughts of protecting her family from dangers only a child could see. Ranger sat back on his haunches, watching Caleb with the quiet intensity of one who knows more than he can say, ears twitching at the faintest sounds of movement in the rain, tail brushing against the wet ground. Caleb took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs, feeling the wetness on his skin, the rhythm of the town, the rain, and the dog's presence. And he understood that they had stumbled upon more than objects. They had found the echoes of a life meant to be remembered, a story meant to reach someone patient enough to listen, someone strong enough to carry its weight. The chapel walls loomed behind them, silent witnesses to the unearthing, and the tree overhead shed the last of its raindrops like tiny glass beads falling into the puddles below. Caleb gently picked up the journal and photographs, securing them inside his jacket, and as he did, he sensed Ranger shift beside him, body taut with focus, eyes scanning the yard once more. Caleb nodded to the dog, a silent acknowledgement of partnership and trust. The night stretched on, mist curling around the old stone, the air filled with the soft drip of rain and distant, muffled sounds from the streets beyond, carrying with it a sense of quiet anticipation. The kind that precedes revelation, the kind that tells a Marine and his K-9 that they are not alone, that the town has held its breath for this moment, and that history, long buried, is about to speak. By morning, Greyhaven had begun to remember Emily Harper in whispers. The rain had passed before dawn, leaving the town washed clean but uneasy, every roofline shining under a pale silver sky, every maple tree dripping on sidewalks that smelled of wet leaves and old brick. Caleb had not slept. He sat at the kitchen table in his father's empty house, the small wooden box open before him, Ranger lying beneath the table with his head on Caleb's boot. The house had the same stillness Caleb remembered from childhood, the old wall clock ticking too loudly, the refrigerator humming in the corner, the floorboards answering every shift of weight. On the table lay the silver bracelet, the photographs, the brass key, and Emily's journal. Caleb read slowly, not because the words were hard to understand, but because they deserved patience. Most of the early pages were ordinary in the way childhood should be ordinary. Emily wrote about feeding ducks by the river, helping Mrs. Bell arrange him books at St. Agnes, trying to bake oatmeal cookies for her mother, and burning the first tray. She wrote about how the chapel smelled like candle wax and lemon polish, and how the afternoon light made the colored windows glow on the floor like pieces of heaven. Caleb could almost see her there, a small girl in a blue sweater, kneeling near the pews, touching the colors with careful fingers. But the later pages changed. The handwriting grew smaller. The sentences became shorter. She wrote about grown-ups arguing behind the chapel after Sunday service. She wrote about papers hidden inside a black folder. She wrote about her mother crying in the pantry because a man from town said their house no longer belonged to them. Caleb turned the page and stopped when Ranger lifted his head. The dog had heard something outside. A car door closed across the street. Then another. Caleb looked through the kitchen window and saw 3 neighbors standing near the curb, pretending not to stare at his father's house. A woman in a red raincoat crossed herself. An older man removed his cap. No one came to the door. Not yet. That was how small towns handled old grief at first. They gathered at a distance, close enough to witness, far enough to deny they were waiting. Caleb returned to the journal. One page had been folded twice, its corner worn soft. He opened it with the careful hands of a man handling something alive. Emily had written only 4 lines there. "Mr. Reeves believes me. He said brave people tell the truth even when their voice shakes. I am going to hide the key where God can see. If anything happens." Ranger paused as if the silence after those words belonged to him. Caleb stared at the unfinished sentence. Outside, a church bell from the newer chapel downtown rang 8 times, clean and bright, but the sound only made the old St. Agnes bell in his memory feel heavier. Caleb picked up the brass key. It was small, stamped with the number 17. Not a house key, not a car key, a deposit box key, maybe, or a locker. He turned it over in his palm, watching the dull brass catch the morning light. Ranger rose suddenly. His nails clicked against the kitchen floor. He moved to the front door and stood there, ears forward, body alert but not tense. A knock came a few seconds later. Soft, polite, almost afraid. Caleb opened the door to find Martha Bell on the porch. She was in her late 70s, white-haired and thin, wrapped in a navy coat buttoned to the throat, with gloved hands folded around an old leather Bible. Her eyes were pale blue and wet before she said a word. Behind her, the street was nearly still, though Caleb could see faces in windows now. "You found something," Martha said. It was not a question. Caleb stepped aside. Ranger moved back, allowing her in, but he watched her with the steady courtesy of a sentry. Martha entered slowly, taking in the bare walls, the stacked boxes, the journal on the table. When she saw the bracelet, one hand went to her mouth. For a long moment, there was only the clock and the sound of her breathing. "She wore that every Sunday," Martha whispered. "Her mother gave it to her after her baptism," Emily said. "It made her feel less afraid of thunderstorms." Caleb did not interrupt. Martha lowered herself into a chair, her Bible resting unopened in her lap. "People said she was always imagining things," she continued. "But that child noticed everything. Loose steps, missing hymnals, who needed help carrying groceries, who came to church smiling and left with red eyes. She had a heart that picked up sorrow like a radio picks up weather." Ranger walked to her side and gently placed his head against her knee. Martha's face trembled, but she did not cry yet. She stroked the fur between his ears with a hand that remembered how to comfort. Caleb slid the journal toward her. "Who was Mr. Reeves?" Martha looked down, and the room seemed to grow colder around the name. "Corporal Daniel Reeves," she said. "A Marine. Quiet young man. Came home injured from training, rented the little room behind the chapel while he recovered. He helped Father Callahan repair the fence, fixed the furnace, shoveled snow for the widows." Emily followed him around like he was her big brother. Caleb felt something move beneath the surface of the story, some unseen current drawing the pieces together. "And the key?" Martha's eyes lifted to his. Fear was there now, old but awake. "If that key is what I think it is, then Emily did not just hide memories. She hid proof." At that exact moment, Ranger turned sharply toward the window and gave one low, measured growl. Caleb followed his gaze. A black Cadillac had stopped across the street, polished bright against the wet pavement. A tall older man stepped out in a charcoal overcoat, silver hair combed neatly back, his posture calm, his face unreadable. Martha's hand tightened around the Bible. "Harold Grayson," she whispered. "Do not let him touch that box." Harold Grayson crossed the street as if the rain had been ordered to stop for him. His shoes made no hurry on the wet pavement, his charcoal overcoat hanging clean and straight, his silver hair untouched by the damp morning air. He was in his late 60s, tall and pale-skinned, with the polished look of a man who had never carried his own boxes or waited in a crowded office for someone else to decide. His future. Greyhaven knew him as a benefactor, a developer, a man whose name appeared on plaques outside the library, the clinic, and the new chapel downtown. Caleb knew men like him by another sign. They always smiled before asking what you had in your hands. Ranger stood at the window, shoulders square, ears forward, a low warning held deep in his chest. He did not bark. He did not need to. Martha Bell drew the Bible closer to her coat, her thumb pressed into the worn leather cover as though it could keep the past from entering the room. Caleb moved the journal, the bracelet, the photographs, and the brass key back into the wooden box, then closed the lid without rushing. The knock came 3 times, calm and measured. Caleb opened the door, but did not step aside. Harold stood beneath the porch awning, looking past him into the house with pale gray eyes that missed nothing. "Staff Sergeant Whitaker," he said, voice smooth as old varnish. "I heard you were back in town. I am sorry about your father." Caleb held the door with one hand. "Thank you." Harold glanced down at Ranger, who had come to Caleb's side and planted himself just inside the threshold. The dog's amber eyes fixed on Harold's face. For the first time, the old man's smile thinned. "Beautiful animal," Harold said. "Working dog. He knows when something is wrong." A quiet stretched between them. From across the street, curtains trembled in several windows. A delivery truck rolled slowly past and kept going. Harold adjusted one leather glove. "There seems to be a misunderstanding about the chapel property. St. Agnes has been under private development review for nearly 2 years. The grounds are unstable. I would hate for anyone to get hurt wandering around ruins that should have been cleared long ago." Caleb did not blink. "Is that why you came?" Harold's eyes flicked again toward the kitchen table. I came because half the town believes your dog found something last night. Old places collect old things. Trinkets, scraps, stories that grow teeth after sitting in the dark too long. Behind Caleb, Martha's chair creaked softly. Harold noticed the sound and leaned just enough to see her. "Martha," he said warmly, still carrying that Bible everywhere. Martha's voice was small, but steady. "Some things are worth carrying." Harold's smile did not reach his eyes. "So are burdens, apparently." Ranger gave one quiet growl. Caleb placed a hand near the dog's collar, not to restrain him, but to remind him he was understood. Harold looked back at Caleb. "Whatever you found, I suggest you bring it to my office. I have lawyers who can preserve it properly. The town has suffered enough from speculation." Caleb felt the old Marine part of himself settle into place, not loud, not angry, simply unmoved. If it belongs to Emily Harper, it goes to the police. For 1 second, Harold's expression changed. It was fast, like a crack of light beneath a closed door. Then it was gone. "Emily Harper was a tragedy," he said. "But tragedies do not become truth just because a dog digs in the mud." Martha stood then, slowly, using the table for balance. She was not mud, Harold. The room went still. Harold looked at her, and something colder than irritation passed through his face. No one said she was. Caleb stepped onto the porch, closing the door halfway behind him, leaving Ranger and Martha inside with the box. The air smelled of wet maple and engine oil. "You should leave," Caleb said. Harold's eyes hardened in a way his voice did not. "You were gone a long time, Caleb. You do not know what this town survived. Maybe that is why I can see what it buried." A siren sounded far off, not urgent, just a patrol car turning somewhere near Main Street. Harold glanced toward it, then back at Caleb. "Be careful mistaking memory for evidence." He turned away before Caleb could answer, walking back to the Cadillac with the same controlled calm he had arrived with. But Ranger was not watching Harold anymore. Inside the house, the German Shepherd had moved to the kitchen table. His nose was pressed not to the box, but to the brass key Caleb had placed beside it after closing the lid. He nudged it once, then looked toward the door, then toward Martha. Caleb re-entered and saw the change immediately. "What is it?" Martha's face had gone pale. She pointed to the number stamped into the key. 17. "The old bus station had lockers," she whispered, "before they turned it into the visitor center. Emily used to wait there for her mother after school." Caleb picked up the key. It felt warmer now, as if the morning itself had put a pulse into the metal. Ranger walked to the front door and sat, gaze locked toward town. No command had been given. No leash had been lifted. But the message was clear. The bracelet had led them to Emily's name. The journal had led them to Daniel Reeves. And now the key wanted to lead them somewhere Harold Grayson did not want reopened. Caleb and Martha stood in the kitchen, the morning sunlight filtering through the cracked blinds, casting pale lines across the wooden floorboards damp with the last of the overnight rain. Ranger sat alert by the table, ears flicking at every small sound outside, tail resting lightly on the floor as if ready to guide them at a moment's notice. Caleb traced his fingers along the brass key, feeling its cold solidity and the weight of decisions yet to be made. He turned to Martha. "The bus station," he said softly, his voice steady but low. "It still has the old lockers. Emily would have hidden things there, safe from eyes that did not understand." Martha nodded, gripping her Bible with one hand while the other brushed Ranger's thick coat, her face lined with years and worry, but her eyes bright with the echo of memory. They stepped outside, the town quiet in the early morning, dew glistening on the lawns and rooftops, the air filled with the faint scent of wet asphalt and pine from the surrounding hills. Caleb led the way, Ranger close at heel, sniffing every patch of grass, every stone, until they arrived at the old bus station, a small brick building with shuttered windows and faded signage, the number 17 painted faintly above a side entrance. Caleb pushed the door open carefully, the hinges creaking under the years of disuse, and stepped inside, the air thick with the must of disuse and the lingering faint smell of bus fuel and oil. Ranger padded silently ahead, nose low, scanning the floor, tail flicking in anticipation, ears up as he followed the trail Emily had left. Caleb followed, eyes adjusted to the dim light, noting the scattered papers and old lost items, the echo of footsteps from years ago seeming to whisper through the empty hall. Ranger paused at the far wall, where a row of rusted lockers stood, the brass key in Caleb's hand fitting perfectly into the lock of one, though the lock was stiff and hesitant with age. Caleb turned it gently, the tumblers moving with a soft click, and the door creaked open, revealing the contents inside. A bundle of carefully wrapped papers, a small notebook, a photograph of Emily with a young Marine, Daniel Reeves, and a folded piece of cloth with her initials stitched faintly along the edge. Caleb lifted the notebook, brushing dust from the cover, and opened it to find pages filled with Emily's small, precise handwriting, detailing observations, hopes, and the names of neighbors and townfolk who had been kind and who had not, every word chosen with care and purpose. Ranger pressed against Caleb's leg, nudging him forward, urging him to continue, his amber eyes reflecting the faint morning light and the depth of understanding only a loyal companion could hold. Caleb read through the journal carefully, noting Emily's concerns about her mother, her meticulous hiding of documents, and her hope that someone who could understand would eventually discover the truth. Martha stepped closer, peering over his shoulder, her fingers grazing the photograph and the notebook. She wanted someone to find this, she said, voice trembling. She trusted that someone would see it. Caleb nodded, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him. The same weight he had carried in distant lands, now returned to a quieter, yet no less urgent, mission. The building creaked around them as wind whispered through cracks in the roof, and Caleb imagined Emily standing there, small and determined, placing each item carefully, believing in the unseen hand of Providence to guide the right person to them. Ranger sniffed at the bundle, then backed slightly, signaling to Caleb and Martha that the next step was theirs to decide. Caleb wrapped the papers and photograph carefully, tucking the bracelet inside, and stood, feeling the gravity of the moment, the town itself holding its breath as if aware that the past was being unearthed for the first time in over a decade. They stepped back outside, the morning air cold but clear, the town quiet, every leaf on the trees, every shuttered window, every distant roof watching as Caleb, Martha, and Ranger prepared to carry Emily's story forward, knowing that what was hidden was now revealed, and the weight of memory, truth, and loyalty rested in their hands. By the time Caleb, Martha, and Ranger reached the steps of the Greyhaven Police Department, the morning had turned bright in that fragile way mornings do after rain, as if the whole town had been rinsed but not healed. Sunlight slipped between the clouds and laid thin gold across Main Street, touching the bakery windows, the courthouse clock, the wet hoods of parked cars, and the old bus station behind them, where Emily Harper's hidden locker had finally opened after 12 silent years. Caleb carried the bundle inside his field jacket, wrapped close against his chest, not because the papers were fragile, though they were, but because they felt entrusted. Ranger walked at his left side, steady and solemn, his sable coat still marked with streaks of dried mud from the chapel yard. Martha followed a step behind, her Bible held against her heart, her face pale but resolved. The police department was small, only one front desk, 2 offices, a bulletin board with missing bicycle notices, and the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. Deputy Aaron Pike looked up from his paperwork when they entered. He was young, maybe 28, with sandy blonde hair, a square jaw, and the uneasy politeness of a man who had grown up hearing stories older than his badge. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker," he said, then noticed Martha, then Ranger, then the way Caleb's hand rested over the inside of his jacket. "Is everything all right?" Caleb placed the wrapped bundle on the counter. "We found something connected to Emily Harper." The name changed the room. Not loudly. No chair fell. No alarm sounded. But Deputy Pike's face tightened, and the old dispatcher behind the glass stopped stirring her coffee. Caleb unwrapped the cloth slowly, laying out the bracelet first, then the journal, the photograph of Emily standing beside Corporal Daniel Reeves, the folded papers, and the brass key stamped with 17. Deputy Pike stared at them as if each item had its own weather. "Where did you get these?" "From Street Agnes in the old bus station lockers," Caleb said. "Ranger led us to the first box." The deputy looked down at the dog. Ranger sat beside the counter and met his eyes without moving, calm as stone. Martha stepped forward. "Emily hid them. She meant for someone to find them." Deputy Pike swallowed. "Sheriff Monroe is not in yet. Call him, Caleb said. There was no edge in his voice, only weight. The kind that made refusal feel disrespectful. Pike picked up the phone. While they waited, Caleb looked around the station. On one wall hung framed photographs of past sheriffs, old Greyhaven parades, Memorial Day flags, and Little League teams lined up in dusty uniforms. In the corner was a faded picture from 13 years ago, showing a church fundraiser outside St. Agnes. Caleb stepped closer. There was Martha, younger, smiling beside a table of pies. There was Father Callahan, thin and cheerful. There was Daniel Reeves in a plain blue shirt, one hand raised awkwardly at the camera. And near the edge of the frame stood Harold Grayson, smiling behind Emily's mother with one hand resting on a folder tucked beneath his arm. Caleb leaned in. The folder was black, the same kind Emily had described. His pulse slowed. He had learned long ago that truth rarely arrived all at once. It came like water through a crack, first a stain, then a line, then a flood. Ranger rose and padded to the photograph, sniffing the frame. His nose touched the glass directly beneath Harold's hand. Deputy Pike returned from the phone, his face more serious now. Sheriff is on his way. Martha looked at Caleb, and for the first time all morning, tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. She saw it, Martha whispered. That poor child saw more than any of us wanted to. Caleb opened Emily's journal to the page he had marked with a strip of cloth. The words were, small, careful, written by a child trying to be brave with a pencil. Mr. Grayson says Mama signed the paper, but Mama says she never did. Mr. Reeves told me documents can lie when bad people hold the pen. I put the copies where the buses sleep because nobody looks there anymore. If Mama loses the house, I hope God sends someone with kind eyes. Caleb felt the room narrow around those words. Deputy Pike read them once. Then again, his expression changing from doubt to something closer to shame. The front door opened, and Sheriff Thomas Monroe entered with his hat in hand, a white man in his early 60s with a tired face and silver stubble along his chin. He had the look of someone who had served a town too long to believe any street was innocent. His eyes moved over the items on the counter, then to Martha, then to Caleb. I heard you found evidence, he said. Caleb did not answer right away. He picked up the black and white photograph of Daniel Reeves and Emily. In the picture, Emily was grinning, holding a small paper star she must have made in Sunday school. Daniel stood beside her with his hands folded, not smiling exactly, but watching her with the gentle patience of someone protecting a light from the wind. Was Corporal Reeves part of the original investigation? Caleb asked. Sheriff Monroe's jaw tightened. He gave a statement. Said Emily had come to him scared. Said she had seen documents hidden at the chapel. But then he left town before a formal interview. Martha's voice broke softly. He did not leave town. He died 2 days later. The sheriff looked down. It was ruled an accident. Ranger gave a low sound from beside Caleb, not angry, not loud, but enough to make every person in the room feel the floor beneath them. Caleb turned another page in the journal and found a pressed maple leaf, dry and brown, tucked beside one final note from Emily. He read it silently first, then aloud. Mr. Reeves told me Marines do not leave people behind. I believe him. The station went still. Outside, tires hissed along the wet street. Somewhere nearby, the courthouse clock struck 9. Sheriff Monroe removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Seal the documents. Log every item. We are reopening the Harper file. Deputy Pike nodded quickly, moving with a new kind of urgency. Martha sat down on the wooden bench by the door, both hands pressed to her mouth, tears falling freely now. Caleb stepped outside for air, Ranger following close. Main Street had begun to fill. People stood in clusters near the bakery, the pharmacy, the hardware store, watching the police station with faces full of questions they had carried for years. At the far end of the street, the black Cadillac was parked beside the courthouse. Harold Grayson stood near it, one hand on the door, his gray eyes fixed on Caleb. Ranger moved in front of his Marine without command. Caleb looked down at the dog, then back at the man across the street. The hidden things were no longer hidden. And for the first time since the chapel bell rang in the rain, Greyhaven did not feel quiet. It felt awake. By noon, the steps outside the Greyhaven Police Department had become the place where silence finally ran out of room. People stood along the sidewalk in damp coats and work boots, some holding coffee they had forgotten to drink, some with hands folded the way people stand during hymns when they do not know the words anymore, but still remember the tune. News had traveled through the town without anyone needing to raise a voice. Emily Harper's bracelet had been found. Her journal had been opened. Her old locker had given back what it had guarded for 12 years. Caleb remained near the curb with Ranger at his side, watching Sheriff Monroe carry the evidence box into the station with both hands, as carefully as if he were carrying a sleeping child. Martha sat on the bench just inside the glass doors, her Bible open on her lap, though her eyes were closed. Every few minutes, Deputy Pike moved from desk to desk, making calls, copying papers, sealing photographs in clear sleeves, each small motion turning memory into record. That was the strange thing about truth. For years it could live only in a mother's tears, a teacher's guilt, a Marine's unfinished warning, and a German shepherd's instinct. Then suddenly it needed labels, signatures, timestamps, and evidence tape. Caleb understood the need for order. He had lived by it. But some things felt older than procedure. Some things arrived like a bell note from a broken tower. Across Main Street, Harold Grayson still stood by his Cadillac. He had not approached again. He only watched, one hand resting on the open door, his face arranged into public calm. Beside him stood a young assistant in a navy suit, talking quickly into a phone. Harold did not answer. His attention stayed fixed on the police station, on the crowd, on Ranger. The dog sat tall, unmoving, amber eyes locked across the street with a steadiness that made several townspeople glance from him to Harold and back again. Caleb rested one hand lightly on Ranger's shoulders. "Easy," he murmured. Ranger's ears twitched, but his body did not soften. A woman stepped out of the crowd then, small and gray-haired, wearing a tan cardigan beneath a rain jacket too large for her frame. Her face was thin, her eyes sunken with the kind of sorrow that does not age, only settles deeper. Conversations faded as she approached. Martha saw her through the window, and stood so quickly the Bible nearly slipped from her lap. Caleb knew who the woman was before anyone said her name. Ruth Harper, Emily's mother. She walked with a cane, slowly, each step careful on the wet sidewalk. No one touched her. No one rushed her. The crowd opened around her, as though the whole town understood that grief has its own pace. Sheriff Monroe came out carrying the silver bracelet in a clear evidence sleeve. His face had changed since morning. He looked less like an official and more like a man who wished he had asked different questions long ago. "Mrs. Harper," he said softly. Ruth looked at the bracelet through the plastic, and the little strength in her face seemed to leave all at once. Her cane trembled. Caleb stepped forward instinctively, but Ranger moved first. The German shepherd crossed the short distance and stood in front of her, not touching, not crowding, simply offering his body as something steady in a world that had shifted under her feet. Ruth lowered one hand and rested it on his head. Ranger closed his eyes. That was when she began to cry. Not loudly, not with the sharp sound people imagine. It came quietly, like water finding a crack in stone. Martha reached her and wrapped both arms around her shoulders. The two women stood there together beneath the pale noon light. One who had lost a child, and one who had carried the memory of that child through 12 years of unanswered Sundays. Sheriff Monroe cleared his throat, but his voice still broke at the edge. "We found documents in the locker," he said. "Copies of property transfers. Signed statements. Notes from Corporal Reeves. We are still reviewing everything, but it appears Emily was trying to protect you." Ruth looked up slowly. She was 11. No one answered. There was nothing useful to say to that. Caleb felt the sentence land across the sidewalk, heavier than any accusation. She was 11. Old enough to notice fear. Young enough to believe hiding truth in a locker could save the person she loved most. Deputy Pike came to the door, holding another folder. "Sheriff," he said, then stopped when he saw Ruth. His voice lowered. "We matched the copies to the old county filings. Several signatures appear inconsistent. The bank records need review, but there is enough here for a formal investigation." Harold's assistant stopped talking on the phone. Harold finally closed the Cadillac door. The sound carried down Main Street, clean and final. He began walking toward them. The crowd stiffened. Ranger turned before Caleb did. This time, the dog did not growl. He simply stood between Harold and Ruth Harper, head high, paws planted, a silent line drawn on the wet pavement. Harold stopped 10 feet away, his expression composed, though the color had left his face. "This is becoming a spectacle," he said. "Mrs. Harper deserves privacy, not theater." Ruth wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her voice was thin, but it carried. "My daughter deserved the truth." Harold's jaw tightened. Caleb saw it, and so did half the town. Sheriff Monroe stepped down from the police station steps. "Mr. Grayson, I need you to come inside and answer some questions." Harold looked at the sheriff as if the man had forgotten his place. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that a child left behind more courage than this town knew what to do with." The words did not sound like police language. They sounded like confession. Harold glanced at the crowd. Faces he had known for decades looked back at him, not angry, not cheering, simply awake. The old spell of his name had weakened. Caleb watched the moment settle over him. Money could build a clinic. It could put brass plaques on brick walls. It could make people lower their voices for years. But it could not command a dog to look away. Harold turned toward the station without another word. As he passed Ranger, the German shepherd did not move. Caleb did not either. Ruth Harper kept her hand on Ranger's head, fingers trembling in his wet fur. When Harold disappeared through the glass doors, the town remained silent. Then from somewhere behind them, near the far end of Main Street, a child asked her mother who Emily was. Ruth heard it. She turned toward the voice, and for the first time, her face held something beyond grief. Not peace. Not yet. But the smallest beginning of being believed. Caleb looked toward the hill where St. Agnes stood hidden beyond the rooftops, its broken bell tower cutting into the brightening sky. The town had thought the chapel was empty. But maybe empty places are sometimes just waiting for the right soul to listen. Ranger leaned gently into Ruth Harper's hand, and in that small motion, the day changed. The investigation had begun, but the healing had begun too. That evening, Greyhaven gathered at St. Agnes without being asked. No notice had been printed. No pastor had rung a bell. No one had gone door to door. Still, by the time the sun lowered behind the Vermont hills and painted the wet grass in amber light, people began arriving in twos and threes, walking up the narrow road toward the old chapel with flowers, lanterns, folded hands, and the uneasy reverence of those returning to a place they had avoided too long. Caleb stood near the broken iron gate with Ranger beside him, watching the town come slowly through the dusk. The chapel looked different in that hour. Not repaired, not redeemed. Its paint still peeled. Its windows were still cracked. Ivy still climbed the back wall like time itself, trying to cover the wounds. But beneath the soft evening light, St. Agnes seemed less abandoned than waiting. Martha Bell arrived with Ruth Harper on her arm. Ruth moved carefully, her cane tapping the gravel, Emily's bracelet now resting in her palm inside a small clear evidence sleeve Sheriff Monroe had allowed her to hold for the memorial. Just for the evening, just long enough to say what 12 years had denied her. Ranger noticed her at once and stepped forward, not with excitement, but with recognition. He lowered his head until Ruth could touch him. She did, fingers trembling over the sable fur between his ears. "You brought her back to me," she whispered. Caleb looked away, giving her the dignity of a private sentence in a public place. Near the chapel steps, Sheriff Monroe stood with Deputy Pike and 2 state investigators who had arrived from Montpelier that afternoon. Their presence was quiet, respectful, necessary. Harold Grayson was not there. By sunset, he had been taken to the county office for formal questioning, and his lawyers had arrived with black briefcases and careful faces. But the town did not speak much of Harold that evening. His name had filled enough rooms. Tonight belonged to Emily. Inside the chapel, dust floated in the air where lantern light touched it. The pews were warped, the floor creaked, and the old altar cloth had yellowed with age. But people stepped in gently, as though they might wake something holy if they moved too fast. Someone had swept a path down the center aisle. Someone else had placed wildflowers on the altar. A little girl no older than Emily had been when she vanished set a paper star beside them, folded from blue construction paper. Caleb saw Martha notice it and cover her mouth. Ranger walked slowly down the aisle, nose low, pausing at the 3rd pew from the front. He sat there. Martha drew in a breath. "That was where Emily sat," she said. "Every Sunday. 3rd pew. Left side." She said the window made her shoes look purple. Ruth made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Caleb remained standing at the rear, his hands folded before him, his posture still military even without a uniform. He had thought coming home would mean leaving quickly, sign the papers, sell the house, drive away before memory got its hands on him. But now, standing in the chapel where a child had hidden truth and a Marine named Daniel Reeves had tried to help her carry it, Caleb felt the old definition of mission change inside him. Not every mission came with orders. Some came with a dog stopping in the rain. Some came with a key stamped 17. Some came with a town finally brave enough to look at its own silence. Sheriff Monroe stepped to the front, removed his hat, and opened Emily's journal to the page Ruth had chosen. His voice was rough, but steady. Mom says brave means not being scared, but Mr. Reeves says that is wrong. He says brave means doing the right thing while your hands shake. My hands shake when I write this. But I am going to hide the papers, because Mama cried again today, and nobody should lose their home because somebody important tells a lie. The words moved through the chapel like wind through wheat. No one cried loudly. That would have been easier. Instead, tears fell silently. A man in a mechanic's jacket wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The bakery owner bowed her head. Deputy Pike stared at the floor. Ruth sat in the third pew with Martha beside her, holding the bracelet close to her chest. Caleb felt Ranger shift before he saw him move. The German shepherd rose, walked to Ruth, and gently laid his head in her lap. For a long moment, she simply rested both hands on him, her thin fingers sinking into his coat. Then she whispered, "She was brave." Martha nodded through tears. Yes, she was. Outside, the sky deepened to blue. The first evening star appeared above the broken bell tower. Caleb stepped out through the chapel doors for air and found himself looking up at the old bell, dark against the last light. It had rung once in the rain when no hand touched it. He could not explain that. He did not try. Marines learned there are things you trust before you understand them. The shift of a dog's body, the change in air before a storm, the weight of a silence that means someone is still waiting to be found. Behind him, voices began to sing softly. Not organized, not strong at first. Just one hymn, remembered piece by people who had not stood together in that chapel for years. Ruth did not sing. She held Ranger and wept quietly, not from the wound reopening, but from the terrible mercy of finally having someone believe where it had hurt. Caleb looked through the open doors and saw the lanterns glowing around the pews, the faces lit gold, the paper star on the altar, the journal resting beside wildflowers. The investigation would take time. Papers would be reviewed. Statements would be taken. Men with titles would explain what they could and hide what they could not. But some verdicts arrived before courtrooms. By the time the hymn ended, Greyhaven had already changed. Emily Harper was no longer a rumor, no longer a cautionary whisper, no longer the little girl people mentioned only when rain fell hard near St. Agnes. She was a daughter, a witness, a child who had done the right thing while her hands shook. And at the center of it all, a German shepherd rested against her mother's knees, as if guarding not evidence, but grace. The night fell softly over Greyhaven, cool and still, with the last glimmers of sunlight fading behind the hills, leaving the chapel and the streets in a quiet bluish haze. Lanterns remained lit around St. Agnes, casting long shadows across the damp grass and cobblestone steps, the soft flicker like memories moving gently in the air. Caleb stood near the edge of the yard, Ranger at his side, ears twitching at distant sounds, tail brushing lightly against his leg. Martha and Ruth Harper remained inside, sitting together on the third pew, hands folded over Emily's bracelet and the journal, their eyes reflecting the glow of lantern light, faces marked with lines of sorrow and relief interwoven. Caleb looked out toward the empty streets, noting the houses closed and quiet, but feeling the pulse of the town still present, silent watchers behind curtains, neighbors who had remembered and forgotten, who now carried a quiet curiosity that matched the wind brushing through the wet leaves. Ranger moved slightly, nudging Caleb's hand as if reminding him that some things could not be hurried, that patience and vigilance were as necessary as action. Caleb took a deep breath, the smell of wet pine and old stone filling his lungs, letting the calm of the night wash over him, though the weight of what had been uncovered rested heavily on his shoulders. He imagined Emily standing here, small, precise, certain that someone would come who could understand the significance of her actions, that her small bravery could guide others to the truth she could not fully tell. Caleb touched the collar of Ranger lightly, the dog's steady warmth grounding him in the moment, reminding him that they had been chosen for this task not by chance, but by attention, care, and a shared instinct that transcended words. Inside the chapel, the soft murmur of Martha and Ruth had quieted into silence, the journal resting open on the altar beside the pressed maple leaf, a single line of Emily's writing catching the dim light. "If anyone finds this, remember me, and do what is right." Caleb knelt at the steps, watching the lanterns sway gently in the breeze, casting a halo of light that fell on the damp grass where the first discoveries had been made, thinking of the 12 years that had passed, the patience it had required, and the courage a child had mustered to preserve truth for those who could carry it forward. Ranger lay down beside him, head on Caleb's boot, a silent guardian, sensing the weight and relief in equal measure. The town's hush deepened by their presence. The chapel bell tower, still broken but intact against the horizon, seemed to lean forward, holding the night in careful suspension, and Caleb could almost hear the faint echo of its bell from the storm months before, mingling with the quiet of the present, signaling that time and memory had converged in this place. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying faint scents of wet earth and nearby river, and Caleb realized the town itself had begun to breathe differently, having witnessed what had been hidden for so long. Children's laughter from a distant street floated softly on the breeze, interrupted by an adult's quiet comment to turn in for the evening. Every shadow seemed less oppressive now, every space within the chapel and yard less lonely. Caleb rose, feeling the familiar stiffness in his legs, but with a sense of completion he had rarely known in his life, even on missions overseas. He glanced at Ranger, who lifted his head briefly, amber eyes catching the last bit of twilight, then settled again, calm and unwavering. Caleb reached into his jacket, touching the evidence once more, feeling the cold metal of the key, the smoothness of the bracelet, the rough edges of the journal, and realized that some duties were carried in silence, in witness, in the act of being present when needed. The town's rooftops glistened under the emerging stars, a slow rhythm of night crickets and distant owl calls adding a soft music to the scene. Caleb thought of Daniel Reeves, of Emily Harper, of Ruth and Martha, and of the generations who had carried memories of St. Agnes in their hearts. He understood that the mission had shifted from discovery to stewardship, that knowing the truth brought responsibility as much as clarity. Ranger rose, stretching, then nudged Caleb once more, guiding him gently toward the chapel doors, where the women waited. Caleb followed, stepping into the doorway, the soft glow of lantern light washing over all of them. The chapel had been silent for years, yet tonight it held the pulse of those who had remembered and those who had believed. Outside, Greyhaven was dark but awake. Lanterns, soft footsteps, whispers of leaves, the quiet ripple of a river, all bore witness to the fact that the past had been acknowledged, that bravery, faith, and loyalty had intersected in a way that would linger far longer than any single night, and that some stories do not end in closure, but in grace, where the living, the remembered, and the faithful find a moment of stillness and recognition, the kind that settles over a town like soft light over wet grass, leaving everyone quietly changed, holding hope in the steadiness of a dog and the courage of a child.